Alrighty, this is going to be kind of a weird one because I'm having a little bit of problem with my display here, but I'm going to go ahead and get this one out. Yeah, so it's kind of half a joke and not. Years and years ago, I remember back in the '90s watching being a kid. There was all this content in the '90s. It seemed like, especially like 9 p.m. on a Saturday, like on basic cable channels like USA, you know, and then around came Comedy Central where you would have these stand-up comics, and in retrospect I now realize that they're mostly using this footage. It was essentially just filler. They throw a camera up at a comedy club somewhere and take the footage and then repackage it, put it on TV so that 14-year-old boys in middle America who had nothing better to do on a Saturday night, that was all they could do was watch basic cable comedy. So I remember, and I don't know who the comedian was or whatever, but the joke, the bit was essentially somebody running for or aspiring to be vice president of the United States. And the joke was kind of, oh man, you can just sort of do whatever you want, insofar as basically just go on a big long vacation and just sort of, hope that you're not called upon to succeed in the line of succession to the presidency because, the president passes away. That was kind of the joke. But I've been thinking about it lately, and honestly, and this is about the only political opinion I have, because at least about the United States, because I haven't lived in the U.S. in 5 years. I haven't even been there in 5 years. I haven't lived there in 15. I feel really weird about having a lot of political opinions about how things should be run in the United States. I'm just not there. Now, I have my own opinions about the efficacy of various presidents and the United States federal government in a foreign context. So, to some extent, I keep my finger on the pulse of politics stateside. I've always been kind of a political junkie, so I've always kind of enjoyed it. But I view myself these days especially as nonpartisan, mostly because I'm not real thrilled, especially at a federal level, with what either of the political parties are really getting up to. Although these days I've got far less of an issue with what the Republicans are doing than what the Democrats are doing. But that's not to say that either of them are perfect. And quite frankly, I'm wondering where much of anybody is on the right or in so-called conservative spheres when it comes to some pretty major fundamental issues of the day. Leaving that aside, point of this video, I've had this kind of pet thought in my head for really going back to probably about 3 months after January 6th. And I want to be clear, I don't really fully comprehend what the heck happened on January 6th back in the United States, back in D.C. I kind of remember having half an eye on it at the time because, it was kind of what was going on and leading up to it. People kind of forget the lead up to that day, that there was a lot of hyperbole in the press and stuff leading up to that, and sort of talk about, are there any mechanisms which can be triggered to sort of deal with issues associated with the votes that occurred prior to Jan 6, and in the presidential election? And on a personal level, I have real qualms, maybe that's an understatement, with a lot of the procedures that went into the vote, the voting procedures, because they utilized all of this COVID rationale for pretty much radically changing the way that Americans voted. Then it ended up with an outcome that many people felt was illegitimate. Now, I don't know if I think that ultimately who really won. What I do know is there was a lot of hinky stuff going on there. Again, I don't have enough expertise. It's just from an outsider's perspective, things didn't seem to add. I remember going to lunch, sort of watching the votes roll in. It was about lunchtime here, so it was about noon, so about midnight sort of middle America, U.S. time. And coming back, and the results in different states were wildly different. I remember Wisconsin specifically. That was going one way pretty decidedly, and then I got back from lunch, and nope, we had this huge transfer votes, and everything changed. I don't know. I don't know much about much when it comes to that issue. I wasn't there. I can't speak to it, but to me, it looks like there's some genuine issues that arose, and I'm also kind of I hesitate to say annoyed, but I find it strange that people think that the founding fathers were unaware of the notion of election meddling, or that elections may not come off without a hitch, that in a sense that people may not be 100% fully purely upright and pure when it comes to putting on an election. I think the founders were well aware of that. It's why they created the certification process using the Electoral College that they do. Which sort of leads me to the point of this video, which is the one thing that I can decipher when I read about January 6th, and admittedly I'm not an expert, I've just tried to get an idea of what exactly happened, and clearly I think it's going to be probably another decade before we fully understand what did happen that day, because there's a lot going on. It's very chaotic. And leaving that aside, to my mind, the jury is still out on what exactly happened. One thing I know unequivocally, the people that were outside that were protesting were clearly exercising their constitutional rights. And then you get into this kind of spectrum analysis of the people who were in the building. Should they have been in there? And now it looks really weird where it almost looks like they were toured around. And then the people, there were people that apparently pierced the security bubble of the vice president who was trying to do his job. I'll get to that in a minute. And then, again, it's sort of on this spectrum of what was legal and lawful behavior and what was illegal and unlawful behavior. Again, not the point of this video. What comes across to me is in all of this chaos, sort of in all of this fog of craziness, Mike Pence just did his job. I mean, he the vice president basically has two jobs. Well, three, sort of, but two active affirmative duties, which is break ties in the Senate and certify the election. Count the vote, basically. Like, count the electoral vote. Count the votes of the electors of the several states and certify them, and thereby put in office the next president and vice president. I have a tremendous amount of respect for Al Gore. I remember watching the footage of him in the aftermath of the 2000 election, which, however you felt about that election, clearly there was a lot of controversy that arose out of what was going on down in Florida. And, in retrospect, and I've never known what to believe on that. They've said, well, now that we've done a full count, looks like Al Gore won by 250 odd votes or something like this. Well, whatever, that's great. But we didn't know that at the time, and it didn't get certified at the time, so George W. Bush became president. But I always respected Al Gore, and you can see that footage where, he's there certifying the vote, even though he lost. He did his job. Pence did his job under what appears to me to be extreme pressure. Pence went and just certified the vote, even though that certification resulted in him losing his political office. It's the way our system works. It's your civic duty as the vice president to do that, and he did it. And quite honestly, if I was somebody advising Mike Pence right now, I'd probably sit him down and say, look, I got some bad news for you. I got some good news for you. Probably in the context of the 2024 election, you're not going to probably win or be a particularly viable candidate for president. Just an outsider's perspective, just kind of looking around at the landscape, especially in the aftermath of this indictment against Trump, which I am definitely not going to dive into that because I just I have not had the time to really research it, and it looks Very suspect, to say the least. But again, that's just a superficial observation, and I haven't had time to go into that. But with all this going on, if I was advising Pence, I'd say, look, you're definitely not any kind of a front runner for the presidency, but you should just run for vice president. Because I got to tell you, I would vote for Mike Pence for vice president because he counted the vote. He did his job. And I would actually run on that platform. I would just say, I'm running for vice president. I will count the vote. I would actually use that as my campaign slogan. I will count the vote. That's it. That's it. And then I would tell people on the campaign trail, I'm not doing much of anything else. The minute I become vice president, I'm taking my security detail and I'm taking a trip, a fact-finding tour, whatever you want to call it, to the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico to do a vice presidential study of how many sand pebbles are on the beaches of the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. Honestly, I would just tell people that. I'm going to take my salary, I'm going to take my security team, and I'm going to just go sit on a beach until either A, I need to go break a vote in the Senate, or I need to count the vote. Or obviously, if the president passes, I become president of the United States. And I remember that going back years ago, that sort of stand-up comic, and I can't remember who it was, I just sort of remember it through audio. I remember him saying, vice president sitting on the beach, he gets the phone call, oh my gosh, he's passed. Now I have to actually do a job now, kind of thing. That was sort of the joke. And obviously I'm not delivering it very well. But honestly, under present circumstances, I don't think it's a bad idea. Like I said, I would vote for Mike Pence for vice president because he did his job. He's a known quantity if he's vice president again, no matter who's president. And people kind of forget this. It's sort of viewed as a given that presidents and vice presidents run on the same ticket. That's not true. Constitutionally, you can run for the vice presidency, and if you can get the electoral votes for the vice presidency, you'll be vice president, regardless of who the president is. They're two separate offices. It's really interesting if you watch the movie Vice. There was a book that was based on. I read part of it. I can remember the cover off the top of my head. I can't remember what the title of that book was. But the movie Vice with Christian Bale, where he played Dick Cheney. I would never have thought of having somebody like Christian Bale play Dick Cheney, but man, he played him well. It was really, really well done. And there's a scene where David Addington, who's Cheney's advisor, is talking about the fact, talking about the office of the vice presidency, and it's a very unique office. It's cloaked in not only executive privilege, but also legislative privilege. The vice president is a member of the Senate. He's a tie-breaking vote. He's the presiding member of the Senate. Has legislative immunity, congressional, delegate immunity when it comes to traveling to and from the Senate. I think Aaron Burr used it to dodge a murder warrant for Alexander Hamilton at one point. I mean, it's a very negatively powerful office in the sense that so-called positive freedom and negative freedom being sort of the freedom from things, that's sort of the right to be left alone, if you will. The vice president can really just kind of do whatever they want, but as a practical political matter in the American political sphere, this has never really occurred because the vice president is generally personally beholden to the president, who effectively sort of recruits them. That's that. At least in the 20th century, that's always been how it was. I'm trying to think of. I think there was one convention or one or two conventions, I think on the Democrat side, and I want to say when Adlai Stevenson ran for president, when the convention picked the vice president. That can happen from time to time. But even then, there's a, when that happens, then there's sort of a party loyalty that comes into play. And as a result, again, the vice president kind of dances to the president's tune. There's nothing constitutionally, though, that says that that has to occur. The vice president is just the person sitting in that office. And in theory, if they were independently elected, I mean, who can really tell the vice president what to do? Not much of anybody. I mean, they have the vice president has certain constitutional duties. To the best of my knowledge, I think it's break ties in the Senate, be the guy to replace the president if something happens to him or become him or her, and they become incapacitated or pass away, and certify the vote. That's it. Short of that, like I said, I'm really serious. If I was advising Mike Pence, I would get out way ahead of this. I would run for vice president right now. And I would campaign, and I would just tell people, I'm running for vice president. That's what I'm running for. On the campaign promise that I will count the votes, no matter who ends up being president. It would be, to my mind, it would be hilarious if somebody from the other party ended up president, and then you just sort of had this just like wandering vice president who just kind of does whatever they want. They hang out at the Naval Observatory, have a kegger at the Naval Observatory, something like this. You know, head on down to the U.S. Virgin Islands with their Secret Service detail, hang out on the beach. What are you going to do? It's the vice president. You can't tell them what to do. They just, you know, and especially if they're independently elected, they're just the VP waiting around to do their job at the end of, either in the event of a tie break or just waiting out 4 years to go certify the vote. So I've been thinking about that for a long time. It's just kind of been a running inside joke in my own head to an extent. But on the other hand, there is a confluence of events in American politics right now which could actually lead to a situation where you could just have an independently running and elected vice president. And I think he's got a good campaign slogan, which is, hey, I was under tremendous pressure and I did my job. I only have a couple of jobs and I did them. You know, when called upon, I did it. And I think there's something to be said for it. Oddly enough, I think it could actually kind of change the dynamic of sort of the political campaign for 2024, for the presidency in 2024, if the issue of the vice president was just sort of hanging around out there independently. I really would. And honestly, if I was Pence, I wouldn't even hide it. I would say, look, I did my job. I'm ready to do it again, but I'm here to tell you in the 4-year interim, it's Miller time, period. End of discussion. You know, don't ask me to do anything. I'm going to take my vice presidential paycheck, hang out with my security guys, you know, and whoever else I want to hang out with, chill at the Naval Observatory. I just have parties, hang out with my friends at the Naval Observatory, and then just head off down to the U.S. Virgin Islands whenever I felt like it, and wait around to count the vote next time. You know, I know it's a little bit fanciful, a little bit silly, but I think it's a little bit more viable than it at first appears. In any event, as you can see, that's about, I'm not really thinking about much today. We're getting ready to go into Thai New Year here in Thailand, so it's always a major holiday here. So it's always interesting when we're going into Thai New Year, because you have to basically put all of your, for those who are unaware, Songkran, Thai New Year, they have big water fights here in Thailand, and you basically got to walk around for like a week carrying your cell phone and your wallet and everything in plastic bags. But it's also a really fun time, and frankly, it's been a while since Thailand's had a really good Songkran. So that's what we're going into. If you don't hear anything from me for a few days, that's the reason. But yeah, I've been thinking about that for a while. Thought it was something that maybe folks watching this channel might find interesting. So I guess I'll leave it there, and everybody just have a good one.